Hey everyone, welcome to podcast number 9, the Civil War and Reconstruction. Today we'll be talking about secession, strategies in the Civil War, important battles, anti-war sentiment, and then plans for Reconstruction, and then focusing a little bit more on radical Reconstruction. So let's go ahead and get started here. We left off with the election of 1860 with Lincoln becoming president, and secession in the Deep South happening as a result of that. So if you look at the blue states there, those are states that secede right away. Okay. Eventually what happens is South Carolina then attacks the federal Fort Sumter. And when that happens, Lincoln decides to raise an army because the South is now seen as aggressors. It's seen as a little rebellion here. So Lincoln has to, basically put it down. When that happens, when, Lincoln calls for these troops to be raised, these other states, these gray states, these states will also join the Confederacy. So Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina join the Confederacy at that point. Okay. Now there's other slave states that aren't part of the Confederacy. Okay. You have Missouri, you have Kentucky, and you have Maryland. Okay. And these three states are incredibly important. If you look at these three states and you call them part of the South, they contain 50% of the South's white population. They also have these three border states. They also have a significant portion of the South's industrial capacity. Okay, and so if these states aren't part of the Confederacy, that's going to hurt the Confederacy's chance to winning this battle. Okay, now also to note, Virginia, there's a breakaway. So West Virginia breaks away from Virginia during this war because these West Virginian people here, they're not for the Confederacy. They don't want to fight for slavery, and so they basically exit out and join the Union in 1861. Okay, but basically Lincoln basically keeps these border states as part of the Union by kind of reducing some civil liberties in some of the states, but in his mind he has to have these states. Okay, so real quickly let's kind of go over what are the advantages for each of the sides. Clearly the North has the biggest advantages. Okay, the North has many more people. They have 22 million people to the South's 9 million, and if you take away slaves, the South's got around a little bit less than 6 million. Okay, almost all the manufacturing is in the North. The North has total control of the Navy. They have a stronger, more organized, efficient central government. And on top of that, they have constant immigration that are going to bring in fresh troops, and they're more wealthy. Okay? And so the North has a lot of advantages. Now, the South also has some advantages. The Confederacy, has the advantage of they don't have to conquer the North. The North has to come down and conquer them. And that's going to be obviously a lot tougher. The Confederates have the advantage of fighting on their home territory, which means they don't have to worry about long supply lines. They would hopefully know the territory a little bit better. And we see in the Confederacy, there seems to be a slight advantage in military leaders. I think a lot of times it's overblown. We see, for instance, that there's a lot of incompetent Union generals in the Eastern Theater, but a lot of really competent Union generals in the Western Theater, and that's kind of vice versa. For the Confederacy. Okay, but there's a Civil War historian named Shelby Foote, I think, has a really good line. It kind of sums up the advantages and disadvantages, and he says, I think that the North fought that war with one hand behind its back. If there had been more Southern victories and a lot more, the North simply would have brought the other hand out from behind its back. I don't think the South ever had a chance to win that war. Okay, so from this guy's opinion, the Union advantages were just incredible. But once again, we've seen wars where the stronger nation doesn't necessarily win. Okay, so here's some graphs and stuff that just show the advantages between North and South. You can go ahead and pause it and look at it if you like. Some good data there. Another chart you can go ahead and pause and look at if you wish. Here's obviously a big advantage. We have railroad lines. Clearly there's more railroads in the North, which is going to allow them to move supplies and also move troops a lot faster than they can in the South. So that's obviously a big advantage. Okay. One of the things that's going to be important is to understand the internal dissent that existed in both the North and the South during this war. In the South, I guess the big problem in the South is that these are all states that value states' rights, so they don't like a strong central government, and that's going to make it very difficult for them to prosecute this war because there's no strong central government to lead the war effort. The states have the power to really kind of do what they want. In fact, many states basically keep a lot of their troops protecting their own states. They don't really like to commit troops to the main Confederate army. We also see a lot of resistance from poor whites in the South. For instance, I already mentioned West Virginia breaks away in 1861. But a lot of the Southerners in the mountain regions did not support this war and did not participate in the war because they did not see any reason for them to put their lives on the line to protect other people's slaves. Okay, but once again, the weak central government really put Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, at a real big disadvantage because he didn't really have the power he needed, like Lincoln did, to make things happen when necessary. Okay, in the Union, the North, we see a lot of resistance. Okay, Lincoln privately feels like he won't win re-election in 1864. He thinks he's incredibly unpopular. He feels like these peace Democrats, also known as Copperheads, were going to win against him. They obviously didn't. We also see a lot of constant threat from the border states. While the border states do side with the Union, there's a lot of people within those border states that do go and fight for the Confederacy. So it's very dicey within those states where you can have really brother versus brother. Some choosing, for instance, in Maryland and Kentucky, they fielded regiments for both sides here. So there definitely was some internal dissent in those states especially, and that's where Lincoln had to oftentimes use martial law and take away civil liberties. We also know that there's drafting going on during this war on both sides, and we know that in the North especially there's a lot of resistance to the draft. Okay, many Irish are against this war. There's strong hatred towards African Americans in the North because many white Northerners don't feel like they need to go and die for African Americans. And so there's the very infamous New York riots in 1863, which is what the gangs in New York, I guess, is somewhat loosely based on. So there is, like I said, dissent on both sides. Okay, the Union strategy is pretty clear here. The Union basically wants to surround the Confederacy, divide them in half, and basically just wear them down, which is exactly what they do. The only problem is that it takes forever to do it. Okay, it takes 4 or 5 long years to get her done. But basically, the North knows what their advantages are, and so it's just a matter of wearing down the Confederacy, splitting them in two, and just taking them out, which is, like I said, what they eventually do. The Confederate strategy is a little bit more complicated. A lot of times people talk about the Confederates needed to basically just play defense, and that's not really true. I think that this defensive war of attrition, to a certain extent, is true, but the Confederates needed to have a big victory. Okay, the Confederates needed to have that statement victory where they invaded the North and they won this fantastic victory in Northern Territory, because what the Confederacy needed to win, much like what the colonies needed to win, is they needed to have that European recognition. Okay, and so what we see happening throughout the Civil War is that several Southern generals make very reckless decisions to go ahead and seek that signature victory, yet it is always eluding them. They never actually get that big victory like that Saratoga was for the American Revolution. Okay, and so the Confederate strategy is, yes, they want to play defense, but they do need to win a couple of huge victories, and that's going to make them overly aggressive, overreach a little bit, and they're going to get beat down because of it. Okay, there's a lot of diplomacy that goes on. The Confederates are constantly trying to get European recognition, European aid, European mediation in this conflict. The South basically assumes that King Cotton will win over. They believe that Europe relies on Southern cotton so much that they will need to step in and mediate this war or help the South out. But what happens is that the British basically have these huge surpluses of cotton, so they find they don't really need those southern colonies, or southern states, anymore. They do get close to recognizing, though. The British do help out the Southerners to a certain extent. The British do build some ships for the Southerners. and France basically says they will recognize the Confederacy if the British do. But like I said, the Confederacy never gets that signature victory to prove to the Europeans that they have a chance. And the British are sure as heck aren't going to anger the Northerners. If the Confederacy has no chance of winning, because the British know that if they anger the Northerners, that the Northerners might invade Canada. They're going to have their army all ready to rock and roll, and so it's a very delicate situation for these Europeans to get involved. Okay, here I kind of talked a little bit about some of this stuff already. Just further goes into just how close Europe got in to this war. I talked a little bit about the British shipyards built these ships. In fact, there was even a point where the British were building like these like a super weapon kind of ships for the Confederacy that would have given them maybe a complete advantage on the ocean. And the Union actually, Lincoln, actually threatens war. We kind of allude to the fact that if you do this, we're taking Canada. Okay, and so there was some tension between the British and the Americans during this war. But once again, for the most part, the Europeans stay out of American business. France does take this time to go and invade Mexico because the Americans aren't paying attention. But for the most part, European entanglement, they do get somewhat involved, but they do, for the most part, stay out of it. Okay. Important battles of the war. Battle of Bull Run is the first battle. I'm just going to kind of fly through these. To say one sentence about each one, probably. The Battle of Antietam is important because it is not a huge victory for the Union. It's actually the bloodiest single day of fighting in the war. But it's a victory, and it allows Lincoln to give his Emancipation Proclamation, which basically frees the slaves only in rebellious states. It does not free slaves that are under Union control. So slaves in the border states aren't freed. Slaves in conquered Confederate territory aren't freed. It's simply meant to free the slaves in those rebellious states. Okay, the Battle of Vicksburg is a signature victory for the Union. It basically splits the Confederacy in two by taking control of the Mississippi River. It's a huge blow to the Confederacy. Okay, so the Battle of Vicksburg is usually considered one of the turning points of the war. But for sure, the biggest turning point of the war is the Battle of Gettysburg. Lee basically gets a little reckless and a little too aggressive here, and he invades the North. And he's looking for that signature victory in Northern Territory to try to convince the North to sue for peace, trying to get Europe involved. And it's obviously a major failure. It's the largest battle of the war. Casualties are huge, and the North wins a very decisive victory. Shortly after that battle, Lincoln gives his very famous Gettysburg Address, where he kind of lays out the moral, argument for fighting this war. So obviously some of the greatest words ever spoken in American history by a president. Lincoln wins the election of 1864. He wins against the Copperhead McClellan, who's a former general. Lincoln wins relatively comfortable. Obviously, the Southerners are not allowed to vote, so it's going to give the Republicans obviously a pretty big advantage here. The war ends at Appomattox Courthouse. General Lee basically is getting hammered on by General Grant, the Union general. Grant just doesn't let him go, and he just keeps on throwing troops at him, and Lee's army is just exhausted without supplies, and he sees no point to continue the battle, so Lee does surrender at Appomattox. Okay, and that's usually seen as the end of the fighting. The official surrender comes a couple weeks later, but this is typically seen as, this is it. This is the end of the war. And with that begins the Reconstruction, so kind of pulling the Union back together. And when we study Reconstruction, we need to understand that there are several plans that are proposed. There's a plan put forth by Lincoln, but he obviously gets killed. There's a plan by the vice president who becomes president, President Johnson, and there's plans by the radical and moderate Republicans. Okay, Lincoln's plan. One thing you gotta know about Lincoln's plan is it's very lenient. Okay, Lincoln just wants to kind of forgive and forget, and basically let these states come back into the Union. Okay, let's get the healing over with. Let's get these guys back in. We're going to pardon all the Confederates if they swear an oath of allegiance. Once 10% of the people have swore that allegiance, states can elect state governments and then send people back to Congress. Okay, the Republicans aren't going to like that. The radical Republicans, I should say, are going to be very much against this. These guys, these radical Republicans, they want to destroy the political power of the South, and they want to give African Americans full citizenship and suffrage. So these guys are very much going to want to fundamentally change, life for African Americans and all Americans, for that matter, during this Reconstruction period. Okay, Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, he's also going to step in with his own plan. He's basically going to say that if you swear an allegiance to the Union, if you cancel war debts, and if you ratify the 13th Amendment, you can kind of come back into the Union. And southern states do this pretty quickly because it's seen as a pretty reasonable, pretty lenient policy. The moderate Republicans, though, see this as kind of weak, and they basically start to undermine Johnson. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which gives African American citizenship and forbids black codes. There were laws that were just newly passed by southern states that basically strip African Americans of their rights. The moderate Republicans also established the Freedmen's Bureau, which is basically a government organization that's meant to help people get on their feet. And they also passed the 14th Amendment to ensure that all citizens get equal protection under the law. Okay. What eventually does happen, though, is that the moderates and the radicals do join forces, and they pass the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which does not recognize any of the plans by Lincoln or Johnson, and they basically divide the South up into 5 military districts that have a Union general commanding each of those districts. Okay. And it requires the southern states to give African American suffrage. It requires them to pass the 14th Amendment, and by doing this, that's going to hopefully give African Americans a chance in the South. Okay. Now Johnson tries to stop all this, but Congress overrides him, and eventually Congress impeaches Johnson. And basically Johnson's kind of just an afterthought and doesn't really have much power. President Grant, so Ulysses S. Grant, the former general, he's the president for the majority of Reconstruction. And it's under him where African Americans do see some success, or do see some suffrage, during this period. They're allowed to vote. We see African Americans being elected to Congress, so we are seeing some change going on in the South. Okay, as I previously mentioned, the Freedmen's Bureau was created to help out African Americans. You can obviously read that on your own, by getting adjusted to being free again. The South does resist Reconstruction, obviously. They're not just going to accept this. The KKK is formed by former Confederates, and they become the most infamous, probably, terrorist organization in American history. They kill thousands of African Americans through lynchings and other forms of violence. They use forms of intimidation to keep African Americans from voting, but their goal is to restore white supremacy in the South and to maintain white supremacy in the South by not allowing African Americans to use their political rights. Okay, and they are obviously very effective. Now, Reconstruction does come to an end in 1876, which is one of the odder elections in American history. You have Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, and you have Samuel J. Tilden, who tie in the Electoral College. So they each get, or they don't tie, excuse me, but it's so close that it has to go to a vote in the House of Representatives. Okay, so Tilden wins the popular vote. Okay, but Hayes and the Republicans basically come out and say that, hey, check it out, we'll make a deal with you. Go ahead and give us the presidency. So give the Republicans the presidency, and then we'll end Reconstruction in the South. And so the South's like, sounds good. So you guys can have the presidency. Tilden will, give up or whatever, and we'll end Reconstruction. And so Reconstruction ends because the Republicans wanted to keep that presidency under Hayes. Okay. So anyways, the Compromise of 1877 is the end of Reconstruction. Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops. They agreed to build a railroad from Texas to the West Coast. They agreed to, bring back some infrastructure. And so basically the South is back. The African Americans in the South have been abandoned. All the gains that they've made during Reconstruction will be, for the most part, lost. All their rights, for the most part, will be stripped. They'll be repressed. So it's a sad chapter. It's an abandonment of these these poor Americans that were just freed from bondage here. So, anyways, that's all I have for you today. Feel free to contact me on Twitter. My website there is all my chapter PowerPoints and other podcasts. My YouTube channel is APUSH with Hyde, and feel free to email me any questions. Thanks, guys. Hope this helped.